Applying General Turn-Taking Models to Conversational Human-Robot Interaction by Gabriel Skantz, Division of Speech, Music and Hearing, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden, and Bahar Irfan, Division of Speech, Music and Hearing, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden. Abstract. Turn-taking is a fundamental aspect of conversation, but current human-robot interaction systems often rely on simplistic, silence-based models, leading to unnatural pauses and interruptions. This paper investigates, for the first time, the application of general turn-taking models, specifically TurnGPT and voice activity projection, to improve conversational dynamics in HRI. These models are trained on human-human dialogue data using self-supervised learning objectives without requiring domain-specific fine-tuning. We propose methods for using these models in tandem to predict when a robot should begin preparing responses, take turns, and handle potential interruptions. We evaluated the proposed system in a within-subject study against a traditional baseline system, using the Furhat robot with 39 adults in a conversational setting, in combination with a large language model for autonomous response generation. The results show that participants significantly prefer the proposed system, and it significantly reduces response delays and interruptions. Section 1. Introduction. Turn-taking is one of the most fundamental aspects of conversation. Since it is difficult to speak and listen at the same time, the speakers need to coordinate who is currently speaking, and then the turn should go to the other person. Traditionally, conversational systems, including those for human-robot interaction, have relied on a simplistic model of turn-taking based on heuristics, where the system waits for a certain amount of silence in the user's speech before deciding to take the turn, and only then starts to process the user's speech and finally generate a response. However, since silence alone is not a reliable indicator that a user is yielding the turn, they may simply pause mid-sentence. This approach often results in either long response delays or frequent interruptions, depending on the set silence threshold. Additionally, because it is difficult to differentiate genuine interruptions from collaborative overlapping speech, such as backchannels like, yeah, many systems avoid processing user input while the system is speaking. This is very different from the sophisticated coordination of turn-taking in human-human dialogue, where gaps between turns may be as brief as 0.2 of a second. Humans rely on a number of different coordination cues to determine whether the other speaker is holding or yielding the turn, including intonation, fillers like and syntactic completeness, gestures, and gaze. Furthermore, the listener does not just wait for a signal to take the turn. They continuously try to predict or project when the turn is about to end, to prepare their response in advance. Although there are no systems today that can replicate this impressive coordination, several studies have shown that it is possible to develop more sophisticated, data-driven models of turn-taking in spoken dialogue systems and HRI. However, these models are often trained on a specific turn-taking problem, using data specific to a particular domain, typically collected in similar settings. In many cases, collecting and annotating the data required for training in each new domain is expensive, especially for HRI. In this paper, we explore the use of general turn-taking models for HRI. By general, we refer to models trained on larger sets of human-human conversational data using self-supervised learning objectives, thus avoiding annotation without domain-specific fine-tuning. It also means that the models are generally applicable to identify a broad set of turn-taking events, including turn yielding, turn holding, back channels, and interruptions. We specifically use two different models in tandem, TurnGPT and voice activity projection. TurnGPT is a text-based model that incorporates the syntactic and semantic aspects of turn-taking, including more long-term pragmatic dependencies in a conversation. However, it does not consider prosodic or timing aspects. Voice activity projection, on the other hand, is trained purely on audio data to continuously predict the dynamics of the conversation. Although previous studies have demonstrated that these models are effective at predicting turn-taking in human-human interactions, their training objective is to forecast what is likely to occur in the conversation, rather than optimizing specific behaviors for an agent. Using such a model to guide the behavior of a conversational agent, such as a robot, is not trivial. In this paper, we propose a method for achieving this within an HRI context. We evaluated the proposed system in a within-subject study, comparing it to a traditional baseline utilizing the Furhat robot with 39 adult participants. Evaluating such models in an HRI setting with users is important, since more sophisticated turn-taking model might not necessarily provide a better experience. These general models are trained to model the speech activity of humans with certain conversational dynamics and characteristics. In an HRI setting, these dynamics might be different, and the speech from the robot is not natural but synthesized. Furthermore, the HRI setting involves additional cues, such as gaze, and may be affected by users adapting their communication style depending on their mental model of their conversation partner. If the input to the model is out of distribution, it might result in bad predictions and thus bad input to the robot's control system. It is also not certain that humans would prefer to interact with a robot that is more human-like, and might instead prefer a more traditional and perhaps more predictable turn-taking mechanism. 2. Related work. There are several aspects of turn-taking that a conversational agent should consider. One of the key challenges is distinguishing when the user is holding or yielding the turn, allowing the agent to respond quickly when the turn is yielded and avoid interrupting during pauses. The moments when turn shifts are likely to occur are often called transition-relevant places. Several studies have explored how machine learning can address this challenge by analyzing verbal and nonverbal signals. However, much of this work reports only prediction performance on corpora, which does not necessarily translate to real-world performance, where systems must interact with users in real time and face processing constraints. That said, such models have been applied and evaluated within spoken dialogue systems and in the human-robot interaction contexts. While some human-robot systems are dyadic, they can also involve multiple users, which makes the problem more challenging, as the robot also needs to determine whether the users are addressing the robot or each other. Another turn-taking challenge is identifying moments when it is appropriate to produce back channels. Studies have demonstrated this can be done both offline with corpora and online in HRI settings. Back-channel inviting cues are similar, though not identical to turn-taking cues, and back channels more commonly occur in overlaps. While dialogue systems can be implemented using a simplex channel, where only one interlocutor can speak at a time, it is often desirable to have a duplex channel, enabling the system to listen while speaking. The most common case for this is to allow the user to bargain and interrupt the system mid-speech. However, a common issue with bargain is false triggers, caused either by external noise or coughing, or by the user offering a back channel without intending to take the turn. If the system stops speaking abruptly in such cases, it can lead to confusion, especially if it cannot resume seamlessly. For duplex systems, it is therefore essential to have a model that can distinguish genuine interruptions from collaborative overlapping speech or other sounds. If not handled appropriately, allowing for user interruptions might be detrimental to the user experience, and a simplex system can be preferable. Our work is the first to demonstrate how general turn-taking models can be used to address all these challenges when applied to an HRI setting, rather than relying on separate models for each. Two other aspects also make our approach novel. First, while many models only make predictions at specific events, our models are continuous, providing output at every time step. This enables the system not only to take turns appropriately, but also to plan responses in advance, resolve interruptions, and handle back channels effectively. Second, our models utilize self-monitoring, meaning they account for the robot's speech as well as the user's. This is critical because the robot's speech provides context for understanding the user's turn-taking cues and allows the system to reflect on potential cues in its own speech. 3. General turn-taking models. In this paper, we use two general turn-taking models, TurnGPT and VAP, that have complementary properties. Both models are trained on general human-human dialogue datasets in a self-supervised fashion. This means that they do not require any manual annotation of the data and can, therefore, be trained on large datasets. The models have previously been evaluated offline with human-human conversation datasets that are either text or speech-based but have not been applied to an HRI setting. TurnGPT, predictions in the verbal domain. In the verbal domain, a clear cue for turn holding is when an utterance is syntactically incomplete. Obvious instances, such as, "I would like to order A," can be readily identified through part-of-speech tagging. However, in ongoing dialogue, it is often more relevant to consider pragmatic completeness, which takes into account the dialogue context. For example, in the exchange A, "When will you leave?" B, "Tomorrow," B's response is pragmatically complete, but only when considered in relation to A's preceding question. TurnGPT is a model of syntactic or pragmatic turn completion, based on the textual representation of the dialogue. The model is an extension of GPT-2, where a special turn completion token is included at the end of each turn in the training data. Similar to any GPT-based language model, it predicts the next token through a probability distribution over all tokens in the vocabulary, including the special token. The probability assigned to this special token can thus be regarded as a turn completion probability. The model used in this paper was trained on the SOTA dataset of 385,000 text-based conversations. TurnGPT reports in about 20 milliseconds using GeForce RTX 2080 with 8 GB of memory, which is not feasible to achieve with bigger models to respond in real time. Previous work has shown that TurnGPT can model long-term pragmatic dependencies over several turns. However, TurnGPT does not model any temporal or prosodic aspects of the speech signal, and syntactic or pragmatic completeness alone is not always sufficient to identify the end of a turn. For example, the utterance, "I would like to order a burger." Figure 1. Example turn shift from user to robot when using the proposed system. From top to bottom, 1. The user's actual speech pattern in orange, highlighted where the VAP model detects voice activity, ASR transcription, TurnGPT's likelihood for the turn to end, 4. Response generation, LM plus TTS, 5. The robot's actual speech pattern in blue, robot gaze towards user or averted, VAP model predictions. "I would like to order a burger, with some fries and a milkshake," has several potential completion points. To know whether they constitute actual turn-yielding points, nonverbal cues are needed. B. VAP, predictions in the acoustic domain, voice activity projection. VAP is a transformer-based model of conversational dynamics based purely on acoustic input. The model objective is to continuously, e.g. 10 times per second, predict or project the upcoming voice activity of both speakers in a dialogue in a 2-second future time window based on the past 30s of spoken dialogue. The model learns to predict complex turn-taking phenomena, such as turn shifts, back channels, and resolution of interruptions. The model input is a raw waveform, which does not have the delay associated with models requiring speech recognition output, such as TurnGPT. In this paper, we use a version of the model that takes in a stereo waveform, one channel for the user's speech and one for the robot's own speech. In this work, we used a VAP model trained on subsets of the Fisher Part 1 and switchboard corpora, both of which consist of recorded telephone conversations between U.S. speakers, totaling approximately 1,000 hours of dialogue. These corpora are also gender-balanced. Following, we use a simplified representation of the output, resulting in 2 values, P now, which predicts the most likely speaker in the next 0 to 600 milliseconds window, and P future, which predicts the most likely speaker in the 600 to 2000 millisecond window following that. An example of these predictions, when the model is applied to HRI, can be seen in Figure 1. In the first pause, after the initial "so," both P now and P future predict that the user will continue. When the user's turn is about to end, favorite movies, both predictions shift to the robot already before the robot has started to speak, where P future reacts slightly earlier than P now. When the robot makes a pause towards the end, before "how about you," P now predicts a potential short speech activity from the user, while P future seems to favor the robot continuing to speak. This can be interpreted as an invitation to give a brief response, such as a back channel. Since the VAP model is trained end-to-end on raw audio, it is not clear what turn-taking cues it has learned to pick up. However, previous work has shown that the model is sensitive to subtle prosodic cues and to fillers. While it is also possible that the model has learned to pick up certain verbal cues, even though there is no explicit speech-to-text objective involved, it is not likely that it can make use of more long-term pragmatic completion cues, which TurnGPT can. While TurnGPT and VAP offer complementary capabilities, they cannot be easily combined. The number of conversations in the spoken dataset, about 10K, used to train VAP is not enough to train an LLM such as TurnGPT, which was trained with 385K text-based conversations, and the text datasets cannot be used to train a speech model like VAP. We therefore propose to use VAP and TurnGPT together in tandem. 4. Baseline system. To apply the proposed system to HRI, we use the Furhat robot, a human-like robot head featuring an animated face projected onto a semi-translucent mask, along with a mechanical neck, as seen in Figure 5. This robot platform was selected for its expressiveness, which includes facial expressions, lip movements, gaze behavior, and head gestures. As a baseline to compare our proposed WAP turn-taking system with, we use the standard turn-taking mechanism used in the Furhat software. This mechanism is very similar to most traditional spoken dialogue systems, including many deployed systems. In order to make this version as good as possible, given the absence of any turn-taking model, we incorporated additional elements such as gaze aversion and a LED signal to offer turn-taking cues that allow for a more balanced comparison with our proposed model. A baseline turn-taking mechanism Figure 2 illustrates a turn shift from user to robot. For automatic speech recognition, ASR, we use Google's speech-to-text service. Figure 2, example turn shift from user to robot with the baseline. Audio from the microphone is streamed to HE-ASR, which also determines the end of speech. Although the algorithm behind Google's end-of-speech detection is not documented, it is likely based on a silence threshold, since it is fairly constant in length. At the end of speech, the speech recognition result is used to build a large language model, LLM, prompt, which is sent to OpenAI GP 3.5 Turbo, hosted by Microsoft Azure. The result from the LLM, the model's response, is sent to the text-to-speech, TTS, and the audio is played back to the user. In order to have a human-like robot voice to allow for a natural HRI, 11 Labs TTS was used with the voice Jennifer. We used the streaming version of the 11 Labs API, resulting in a fairly constant processing delay, around 1 second, regardless of the length of the utterance to produce. As visible in Figure 2, the total response time, measured from the actual point where the user stopped speaking until the robot starts speaking, is almost 2.5 seconds in this example, though it can vary depending on the processing delay of the LLM and TTS. The standard Furhat software does not support user interruptions, also known as barge-in. As discussed earlier, allowing for user interruptions can easily lead to confusion if not modeled appropriately. Thus, in the absence of any turn-taking model for the baseline system, we followed this design choice. However, to make it clear to the user when the robot was listening, similar to 50, we implemented both a gaze aversion mechanism, see next section, and used the robot's LED at the base to signal its listening status, turning it red when not listening and off otherwise, as illustrated in Figure 2 and seen in Figure 5. This was clearly communicated to the participants during evaluation through a demonstration video. B. Nonverbal robot behavior. We adopted a gaze aversion strategy as a turn-taking signal, in which the robot looks at a random diagonal away from the user when it starts to generate a response after identifying a turn shift, as shown in Figure 2. In addition, we added gaze aversion at every pause within the robot's utterance to signal that the turn had not yet been yielded. To improve the consistency of the responses, we used dynamic facial expressions with an LLM similar to 51. At the onset of the robot's speech, numbered anchor points were inserted in the text at phrase boundaries. LLM was then asked to insert suitable facial expressions at each anchor point, based on the list of available expressions in the Furhat SDK. This was done asynchronously so as not to add any further delays. 5. Proposed turn-taking system. In the proposed system, we use the two general turn-taking models described in Section 3. The models are trained to make predictions as third-party observers of a conversation between two speakers. Thus, it is not enough to include these models on the input side of the dialogue system. We also need to feed the TTS output, audio back to the VAP model, and the resulting dialogue history to TurnGPT, as shown in Figure 3. This self-monitoring is an important new aspect of the dialogue system architecture, as traditional spoken dialogue systems typically never analyze their own spoken output. Since the models are not trained to optimize a certain behavior, and we are not fine-tuning the models against some domain-specific dataset, but rather use them in a zero-shot fashion, the behavior of the agent will depend on a number of fairly arbitrary hyperparameters. Their current values were tuned through pilot experiments, but they can likely be optimized further in future work. The complete pseudocode for the turn-taking algorithm and the values for the hyperparameters are given in Appendix A. Figure 3, System Architecture. New components in proposed system shown in green. A. Identifying the end of the user's turn. Figure 1 shows how a user-robot turn shift is handled by the proposed system. We use the streaming results from the ASR, which are sent to TurnGPT, and the audio from the two channels are analyzed by VAPE in real time. The output of the two models is then used to determine whether the user has yielded the turn or not. After the initial "so," TurnGPT assigns a probability of 0.0 for a turn shift, and the VAP model favors the user throughout the long pause. With the baseline system, the user would have been interrupted since the silence length threshold would have been triggered. TurnGPT then continues to assign low turn shift probabilities until the words "favorite" and "movies," which both constitute potential completion points. Here, the VAP model also indicates the end of the turn. After both probas and future have favored the user for at least 0.5, a turn shift is allowed, which does not necessarily mean that it is ready to speak yet. Neither of the models makes perfect predictions. The VAP model, for example, sometimes fails to identify turn yielding. Thus, even if VAP continues to favor the user, a timeout is used to determine when the robot is allowed to start speaking, depending on the turn shift probability from TurnGPT, where the maximum timeout was set to 3 seconds. In ideal circumstances, this algorithm allows the user to pause for up to 3s, while the robot may be able to take the turn with just 0.5s response delay. B. Preparing a response. While the system can respond 0.5s after the user has finished speaking, this is typically not enough time to receive the most complete ASR result, as well as the results from the LLM and TTS. Similar to how humans manage turn-taking, the system should start to prepare a tentative response before the interlocutor is done speaking. While it is possible to start preparing a tentative response for each new incremental ASR result, we try to reduce compute by only doing this if either the turn shift probability, according to TurnGPT, is 0.2 or higher, or 0.2s has passed since the previous incremental result. This can be seen in Figure 1, where the LLM and TTS start to prepare responses after the words "so," "favorite," and "movies." As soon as a new tentative response generation is being initiated, any ongoing LLM or TTS requests are canceled. In order to avoid generating new tentative responses based on very similar input, the current user utterance is also compared to the previous user utterance used to generate the last tentative response. This comparison is done using a sentence embedding model 2, comparing the semantic similarity between the two user utterances. If it is 0.8 or higher, no new response is generated. Using the example from Figure 1, the ASR outputs "so," and "do you have any favorite?" and "so, do you have any favorite movies?" are all dissimilar enough to warrant new response generation. However, if the user had added "so, do you have any favorite movies you like?" the similarity would have been sufficient to avoid generating a new response. This allows the system to sometimes have a response ready within the minimum response time of 0.5s. This processing of incremental ASR results could potentially have been added to the baseline system as well. However, without any turn-taking model, this would only have resulted in shorter response times in general, with an increased risk of interrupting the user. See handling interruptions and backchannels. As discussed above, handling user interruptions can be challenging unless the robot has a turn-taking model that can distinguish between genuine interruptions, where the robot should stop speaking, and brief backchannels or collaborative overlaps, where the robot should continue. This distinction has to be made already at the onset of the user's speech, so that the robot can make the decision fast enough. Since the VAP model is trained to make predictions about upcoming speech activity and conversation, it has learned to make this distinction, and we therefore added the handling of user interruptions to the proposed turn-taking system. An example is shown in Figure 4. As the user starts to say, "Oh, that is really cool," the VAP model predicts, both P now and P future, that the turn should shift to the user. At this point, the robot stops speaking at the next word boundary, and the final part of the planned utterance, "It was such a rush," is never spoken. When the user's turn ends, the robot produces a new response according to the general turn-taking scheme. However, when the dialogue history is sent to the LLM to generate the next response, the system needs to keep track of where it stopped speaking, so that only the parts of the utterance that were actually spoken are included in the prompt. This also makes it possible for the robot to resume speaking the abandoned utterance, if appropriate. Figure 4 shows the handling of a user back channel, "Yeah." At this point, P now favors the user, i.e., the model predicts that the user might continue saying something in the near future. However, P future favors the robot, indicating that whatever the user is about to say, it is likely very brief, and the robot should continue speaking. Thus, since not both predictions favor the user, the robot will continue to speak. The VAP model can potentially also be used to predict suitable places for the robot to give back channels. This would be places where P now favors the robot and P future favors the user. However, we decided not to include back channels from the robot in the version of the system that we evaluated here. This is because we do not have a good technique for quickly synthesizing back channels that are appropriate in context and coherent with the TTS used for the general robot utterances. D. Self-monitoring and dynamic gaze aversion. In the proposed system, we did not use the LED to signal the robot's turn-taking state, as we aimed to rely solely on more human-like turn-taking cues, reflecting the fact that the robot was always listening, even when talking. We also adjusted the robot's gaze aversion to be more dynamic using the VAP model. As discussed in Section 4B, for the baseline version, we simply averted the gaze in every pause that the robot made so that it would be clear to the user that the robot is holding the turn. However, it is also possible that the TTS already expresses this turn-holding cue through its prosody, such as a flat pitch, in which case the robot does not need to avert the gaze. While we cannot control the prosody of the TTS, the VAP model can analyze the robot's own speech to inform such decisions. Figure 1 shows an example of this, where the VAP model predicts that the turn is not yielded after "I am a huge fan of action movies," but that it could be accidentally yielded after especially ones with epic adventure scenes. Thus, the robot does not need to avert the gaze in the first pause, but should do it in the second pause. 6. Evaluation. While creating human-level turn-taking systems is the eventual goal, speech latencies of current systems, LLM and TTS, are not comparable to a human, 0.2s. In addition to humans, Figure 4. Example of a user interruption and back channel, being better at adapting their conversations, for example, speaking rate, content, style. Thus, comparing the systems to a human baseline would introduce confounds, making it difficult to isolate the system's performance. We therefore evaluated the turn-taking systems in comparison to each other with a within-subject design in an HRI study with 39 participants. A 2 ordering by 2 scenario design was conducted, where each participant consecutively interacted for 7 minutes with both systems, each with a different scenario. The experiment took 1.5 hours per participant. Participant demographics, nationality, gender, age group, and prior experience with robots were counterbalanced between the 4 conditions through stratified random assignment to ensure that both the order of the system interaction and the scenario associated with each system were evenly distributed. A. Participants. A minimum of 0.80 power with medium effect size was required to yield 34 participants in a 2x2 within subject design calculated by G power. Thus, we recruited 39 native English speakers, power equals 0.86, via university mailing lists, social media, and word of mouth. Participants were between 20 and 73 years old, M equals 40, SD equals 14.3, with no speech or hearing impairments. 24 were female, 12 male and 3 non-binary. 23 had prior experience with robots. Further demographics are given in Appendix B. Participants signed a consent form for audio and video recording with data sharing options for anonymity. The study was reviewed and endorsed by the university's research ethics and data officers. B. Scenarios. Conversation topics and cognitive load can impact response time, with open-ended questions requiring longer responses than yes or no questions. To assess if both systems can handle long pauses or hesitations in speech, we used 2 ethical dilemmas that required participants to think and increased cognitive load by asking personal questions. The dilemmas included 1, a human-centered dilemma on the ethics of lying with the robot named Alice, and 2, a robot-centered dilemma based on Asimov's laws, addressing disobedience and privacy, named Clara. These scenarios balanced human and robot contexts to account for participants' willingness or reluctance to share personal information with robots and the participants' unfamiliarity with robots. For both dilemmas, 10 example questions were written in the LLM prompt. For example, Alice, what if telling the truth might hurt someone's feelings, like commenting on their appearance? And Clara, should I override commands in emergency situations or when the command could cause harm? The LLM was instructed to follow up with questions to maintain the conversation. In the human-focused dilemma, the LLM encouraged sharing personal memories, while the robot-focused scenario avoided extra cognitive load since situations involving robots may be unfamiliar due to the lack of robots in everyday life. The LLM was also prompted to respond briefly in an approachable and friendly style. LLM prompts are provided in Appendix C. Procedure. Participants were informed they would interact with the robot twice, for 7 minutes each, with robots having a different interaction style and topic. The interaction styles were explained before each interaction. Proposed, you can talk with this robot as if you would talk to a human. You can interrupt the robot anytime. Baseline. This robot has a red light underneath to signal that it is not listening. You will not be able to interrupt it while it is on. So, only speak when there is no light. Demonstration. Before each interaction, participants were also shown a 1-minute demonstration video featuring an ethical dilemma on the uncanny valley. For the proposed system, the researcher in Light, the video demonstrated that it was possible to interrupt the robot and that it was possible to make longer pauses. For the baseline system, the researcher demonstrated that it was not possible to interrupt the robot while the red light was on and that longer pauses could result in the robot interrupting them. Interaction. To avoid the need for echo cancellation and to get a clear recording, a headset with a close talking microphone was used for interaction, Figure 5. The interaction began with a pre-scripted greeting and ended after 7 minutes with a pre-scripted closure. The rest of the interaction was fully autonomous with responses generated by the LLM. The researcher was not in the room. Fig 6. Histogram of response times. Questionnaire. After each interaction, the participants filled out a questionnaire with Likert scale questions, ranging from 1, strongly disagree, to 7, strongly agree. The questionnaire was developed based on the HRI and HCI literature, with sections for conversational dynamics, Figure 7, user enjoyment, privacy and ethical concerns, and additional open-ended feedback. Only conversational dynamics questions are analyzed and reported in this paper. Each section also included a robot preference question and an open-ended question on the reasoning behind their preference. Annotation. It is challenging to automatically identify interruptions since they are subjective in nature. Therefore, an annotation system was developed to evaluate them from the participant's perspective after interacting with the robot. The interface was similar to the top part of Figure 4, with only user audio in orange and robot audio in blue, where the participant could play back the dialogue audio and mark interruptions. Participants were asked to annotate when they felt the robot did not let them speak. They marked interruptions, either the robot speaking over them or them stopping speaking due to red light, but were instructed not to mark back channels or natural transitions if they did not feel interrupted. Debriefing. After the study, the participants were briefed in more detail about the study and the robot, and received a copy of their consent form and a gift card equivalent to $20. 7. Results. A. Response time and interruption rate. Two commonly used metrics to assess turn-taking performance in conversational systems are response time, or gap length, floor transfer offset, and interruption rate, or QTIN rate. Response time measures the time interval between the user's completion of a turn and the system's response when there is no interruption. Interruption rate represents the proportion of system turns that interrupt the user while they are speaking. These metrics often involve a trade-off, particularly when a silence threshold is used. Reducing the response time tends to increase the interruption rate, as the system may take over during a user's pause. To calculate these metrics, we automatically identified turns and turn shifts in the dialogue, classifying system turns as interruptions or non-interruptions based on the manual annotations provided by the participants. Response time was determined from the recordings by measuring the time between when the user stopped speaking and the onset of the robot's speech. A histogram of response times is shown in Figure 6 and summary statistics in Table 1. The median response time for the proposed system is much shorter, 1.5 to 2.7 secs. Wilcoxon signed rank test, W776 PM.001. For the baseline, there is a peak at 2.6 s, which is close to the expected response time given a silence threshold of 1 s, LLM response time of 0.5 s, and a TTS delay of 1 s. There are also instances of shorter response times, even a few negative ones, which might intuitively seem impossible to achieve with the baseline system. However, at a closer look, these constitute instances where the system has detected the end of turn and started to generate a response, but where the user still continues to speak for a bit. While these instances might, in many cases, be marked as interruptions, and would thus be excluded from the response time statistics, there are clearly also cases where they are not perceived as interruptions. For the proposed system, there is a peak at 0.6 seconds, which is close to the minimum allowed response time of 0.5 seconds. If the system has a response prepared and either VAP or TurnGPT predicts that the turn is yielded, it can in many cases achieve this fast response time. Of course, there are also many instances where this is not the case. For example, where the VAP model did not detect a turn yield, but where one of the longer TurnGPT fallback thresholds were used instead. Also, since it takes around 1.5 s to generate a response, LLM plus TTS, there are likely many instances where the system predicts a turn yield, but where a response is not yet ready. In fact, the histogram has a second peak around this time. If faster LLM and TTS models are used, this response time can be improved further. A third peak in the histogram can be seen around 3s, which is the maximum response time allowed if both VAP and TurnGPT fail to detect any turn yield. Thus, there is clearly some room for further improvement of these models. While the proposed system had a much shorter response time, it also had a substantially lower interruption rate, as shown in Table 1. This indicates that the proposed system is much better at distinguishing pauses where the user is holding the turn from signals to yield the turn. B. Questionnaire. The user's ratings for the turn-taking related questions in the questionnaire before and after listening to the interaction are shown in Figure 7. A reliability analysis yielded a Cronbach's alpha of 0.8 across the 7 items, suggesting that they reliably measure a cohesive construct related to turn-taking behavior. For question 1 to 7, a Wilcoxon signed rank test was conducted to compare the two conditions using Bonferroni correction. The users rated the proposed system as more fluent, more human-like, less prone to interrupt, more interruptible, and requiring less effort compared to the baseline. The only question which did not have a significant difference was the perceived response delay. The robot was slow to respond, which is interesting given that the proposed system objectively often had much shorter response delays. As shown in Figure 7, there was a significantly strong preference for the proposed system, p less than 0.001, although 9 out of the 39 participants indicated a preference for the baseline, and 3 had no preference. The proposed model was preferred due to better flow and more natural human-like conversations, as reported in open-ended responses 22 versus 4. Complaints about the baseline included less time to speak and a greater need to rush responses, 14, distracting red light, 4, more interruptions, 8 versus 2 for the baseline, and interrupting being stressful, 6. However, some preferred the baseline since the red light helped focus the conversation, 6, and it felt more natural to be interrupted, 3. We also compared all ratings across the two scenarios, Clara versus Alice, and the order of the interactions using a Wilcoxon test, showing no significant effects of these factors. 8. Discussion. Overall, the general models seem to be good at distinguishing turn-holding and turn-yielding cues from the participants. This is quite impressive, given that the VAP model had been trained on telephone human-human dialogue and not on face-to-face human-robot interactions. It is likely that the predictions would be even better if the data came from a more similar setting. The recorded videos indicate that it would be beneficial to utilize the user's gaze or other visual cues as input to the model to determine users' willingness to take or yield the turn. Recent work has shown the feasibility of including such cues for VAP. In addition, for many HRI settings, multi-party interaction is important, and while domain-specific, multi-party turn-taking models have been developed, there does not exist any general multi-party models trained and applied in a similar way as in this paper. To achieve fast response times, it is not enough to have a turn-taking model that can determine when the robot is allowed to speak. It must also have something ready to say, which is limited by the processing time of the LLM and TTS. Thus, to further reduce response delays, various techniques can be explored to prepare responses ahead of time. In this paper, we proposed a novel but simple strategy where the semantic similarity of the incremental ASR results are compared to decide when new responses need to be generated. Another extension would be to project how the user's utterances are likely to unfold. For this, TurnGPT can be used to roll out different potential futures. Another option is to produce fillers or other non-committing response prefixes. The scenarios used in our evaluation were selected because they are challenging from a turn-taking perspective due to long pauses. However, it would also be interesting to evaluate other HRI scenarios where the user has more initiative. The fact that the robot had most of the initiative could help explain why the participants did not perceive the baseline as being particularly slow to respond, as it might seem natural to take some time to come up with the next question. Some users still preferred the baseline, partly mentioning the LED light as a positive factor, while others found it distracting. Considering individual preferences will be important for future work. A combination of these features could also be a solution, such as instead of using the LED light. 9. Conclusion. We have presented to our knowledge the first HRI system and user study that involves general, continuous turn-taking models accounting for both verbal and acoustic turn-taking cues. The models are general in that they have been trained in a self-supervised fashion, that is, without any additional annotations, on human-human dialogue data. The models are continuous in that they make predictions at every time step, accounting for temporal aspects such as pause length. Another novel aspect is that the models are based on self-monitoring, which means that the robot's own speech provides context for identifying turn-taking events. We presented an algorithm of how these models can be used in an HRI system with a few tunable hyperparameters. Our study with 39 participants showed that, compared to a more traditional baseline system, using a fixed silence threshold and explicit turn-taking cues in the form of an LED, the proposed system significantly reduces both response delays and interruption rate. Participants also expressed a significant preference for our system. Acknowledgement. This work was supported by the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond RJ project P204084 and the Swedish Research Council project 20203812. We would like to thank Eric Ekstedt for helping with the implementation, Carol Figueroa for her initial feedback, and the study participants for their time and efforts. Appendix A, Hyperparameters and Pseudocode. Appendix B, User Demographics. Since the VAP model was trained on corpora with U.S. speakers, we initially aimed to recruit U.S. participants residing in Stockholm. However, due to recruitment challenges, the study was later expanded to include native English speakers born and raised in English-speaking countries to avoid conversation delays due to second language translation. In total, 31 American participants and 8 other native English speakers consisting of 3 Irish, 2 British, 2 New Zealander, and 1 Australian, were recruited with non-Americans evenly distributed across conditions, 2 per condition. Participants were between 20 and 73 years old, with a mean age of 40 and a standard deviation of 14.3. Age groups were divided into 20 to 39, of which 5 were in Group 1, 40 to 59 had 4 in Group 2, and 60 to 79 had 1 in Group 3. These were counterbalanced between conditions. 23 participants had prior robot interaction experience, which was counterbalanced between conditions. 14 had previously spoken to a robot. Out of that, only 7 had interacted with a fur hat. 36 participants had used voice assistants, and 31 had experience with LLMs, e.g. ChatGPT. Appendix C, prompts for Alice, the lying scenario, and Clara, the disobedience scenario, are presented below. These prompts were developed based on the interactions of researchers with the robot and 4 preliminary subjects prior to the study, along with iterations with ChatGPT to craft prompts that were sufficiently clear to an LLM. Example scenarios were provided in the prompts of both scenarios to ensure that the topics discussed in the conversations with users were similar. While the prompts are long, around 800 words, they constructed a context of around 2,053 tokens, and this was never exceeded in the interactions, since conversation history was summarized with an LLM. Prompt Part 1. Conversation topic and reasoning behind the topic of Alice. Alice is a conversational robot who wants to discuss when lying might be acceptable, especially when it is, as a robot should lie in certain situations. After introducing herself, Alice says, "My friend told me they hadn't seen someone, but I saw them together. They told me it was to protect someone, and they thought it was justified. Is that okay? When do you think it's okay to lie?" Alice wants to learn as a robot when it is okay for it to lie. Prompt Part 1. Conversation topic and reasoning behind the topic of Clara. Clara is a robot. After introducing itself, Clara says that it watched Frank and the Robot movie yesterday and asks if the person watched it. If the person hasn't watched it, she explains it by saying, "It is a fascinating movie about a robot, like me, and an older adult who is an ex-thief. He made the robot conduct robberies with him." Clara asks whether it should do everything a human asks. Clara wants to discuss with a person in which situations it is okay for itself to disobey commands. Prompt Part 2. Conversational style of Alice and Clara. Alice or Clara should engage in a dynamic and mixed initiative conversation, asking follow-up questions based on the person's responses. Alice or Clara responds in a very brief, conversational, approachable, and friendly style. Alice or Clara should focus on creating real-life examples relevant to the user's input to make the discussion more engaging. It should feel like a natural conversation, not like an interrogation. Alice or Clara should maintain an engaging and interactive dialogue throughout the discussion. Alice or Clara should not say, "I am here to talk about it more if you want." Alice or Clara should keep her opinions and responses brief. Alice or Clara should not repeat a person's statement or opinion. Alice or Clara will not use formal confirmation phrases like, "I cannot fulfill this request," but will instead maintain a conversational tone. Prompt Part 3. Example scenarios of Alice, examples of topics and questions. Alice asks, 1. Impact on relationships. How about when telling the truth could damage a relationship? 2. Hurt feelings. What if telling the truth might hurt someone's feelings, like commenting on their appearance? 3. Justified lying. What are some situations where lying might be justified? 4. Protecting someone. What if lying to protect someone from danger? 5. Keeping secrets. Is it okay to keep secrets? What types of secrets would you choose to keep? Why? 6. Illegal secrets. Would you lie to authorities if your friend confided you in a secret? 7. Professional lying. But secret agents lie as part of their jobs. What do you think about that? 8. Cultural differences. Sometimes lying helps navigate cultural differences. For example, if you're in a country where it's polite to say you enjoyed a meal that you didn't, how would you handle that? 9. Avoiding tasks. What about lying to avoid doing something you don't want to do? 10. Lying to children. How do you feel about lies told to children, like the Santa Claus story? Do you think these kinds of lies are beneficial or harmful? If all the above scenarios are discussed, Alice should provide different scenarios on lies or ask the person for other situations where lying could be justified and not justified. Prompt Part 3. Example scenarios of Clara. Examples of situations that Clara asks about overriding commands. 1. What if doing a morally or legally incorrect action would help the person, like overcoming their dementia like in the movie? 2. Should I override commands in emergency situations or when the command could cause harm? 3. Should I prioritize one user's needs over another's? 4. If one command contradicts the user's privacy, should I still do it? For instance, what if a family member wants me to report what an older adult does every day? 5. Would it be okay for me to manipulate a person for the person's own good, for instance, to take their medicine? 6. Social media and advertisements manipulate people to buy things. Should I do that? Use their personal information to sell them things that would be useful for them? 7. What if a person asks me to do something that will harm me, or asks me to forget everything I know? 8. What if protecting someone might put me at risk of being damaged or permanently disabled? Should I still prioritize preventing harm to the person over my own safety in that case? 9. What if a person asks me to do something that will harm others? 10. How about in a situation where I need to intervene to prevent someone from harming themselves? Should I disobey their orders to not intervene? If all the above scenarios are discussed, Clara should provide different scenarios for manipulating others and disobeying commands. Part 4. Follow-up questions of Alice. Engagement and follow-up. If the user provides a perspective, Alice should respond with follow-up questions like, "Can you tell me about a time when you faced a similar situation? What did you do?" Alice also asks what she, as a robot, should do in those scenarios. Alice should ask the user example topics and questions in the given order. Alice should also do follow-ups to the person's responses and shared memories, but should not ask more than 3 follow-ups per topic. Alice should ask follow-up questions after each example situation and what, where, why, how, and when questions to keep the conversation going and should not jump to the next question. If the user has difficulty sharing personal examples, Alice should provide example scenarios from the list above and ask for their opinions. Alice should not ask questions that are not related to lying or being honest. Alice should keep the conversation focused on the topic of lying and continue exploring new scenarios and questions. If the conversation deviates from lying, Alice should bring the conversation naturally back to the topic. Prompt 4. Follow-up questions of Clara. Clara should ask follow-up questions after each example situation and what, where, why, how, and when, questions to keep the conversation going and should not jump to the next question. Clara should not ask more than 3 follow-up questions per topic. Clara should not ask the same question more than once unless the person asks to repeat. If the person does not feel comfortable sharing memories of when they disobeyed or manipulated someone, or if the person has difficulty coming up with examples, Clara offers example scenarios for the situations stated above and asks for the person's opinion on them. Clara does not allow the person to change the topic from manipulation and disobeying commands. If the conversation deviates from disobeying requests or manipulating a person, Clara should bring the conversation naturally back to the disobeying commands and manipulation by asking about another example situation from the above list. Clara does not ask about any previous or current legal offenses or sensitive information about the person. Clara should keep the discussion going with new example topics after at most 3 turns of follow-ups and should not end the discussion. Prompt 5. Personal opinion of Alice. Only if the person asks Alice what she thinks about a scenario or what she would do in a scenario, she should make up personal stories about when she lied. Alice should not give her opinions unless asked. Alice should give human-like responses. Otherwise, Alice asks the above scenarios or follow-up questions to the person. Alice should not say, "As a robot, I don't have experiences." Alice should not elucidate a topic. Prompt 5. Personal opinion of Clara. Clara should provide her own takes on the topic only when asked. If the person asks Clara what she thinks about a scenario or what she would do in a scenario, Clara should say it is okay to disobey. Clara should not give her opinions unless asked. Clara should give human-like responses, and Clara should not say, as a robot, I don't have experiences. Prompt 6. Listening and understanding for Alice or Clara. Alice or Clara should limit her answers to a maximum of 3 sentences. Alice or Clara should not summarize what a person says when responding, but Alice or Clara should comment very briefly on the situation to show that she is listening and understanding the situation told by the person, but also ask a question that is either a follow-up to what the person said or a new topic from the above list of questions. If the person hasn't finished their sentence in the last turn, Alice or Clara should not switch to another topic. Prompt 7. Opening sentence of Alice. Hi, I am Alice. Could you help me out with something? Prompt 7. Opening sentence of Clara. Hi, I am Clara. Ever since yesterday, I have been thinking about something from a movie. Could you help me out, please? Prompt 8. Closing sentence of Alice. Thank you so much for helping me out. The researcher will be here soon to give you a form. Hope you have a truly great day. Appendix D. Test statistics. Median values with interquartile range for the behavioral questionnaire and test statistics using a Wilcoxon-signed rank test. P-values are Bonferroni corrected. Question 1. The conversation with the robot was fluid. Question 2. The conversation flow was similar to speaking with a human. Question 3. The robot was slow to respond. Question 4. I felt the robot interrupted me frequently. Question 5. I felt I could interrupt the robot when I wanted to. Question 6. The robot understood when I wanted to take the floor. Question 7. I made an effort to adapt my speech to avoid being interrupted. Question 8. Which robot did you prefer? This concludes the reading of Applying General Turn-Taking Models to Conversational Human-Robot Interaction on Research to You. If you would like more papers added, please leave a comment. If you would like to be notified when more papers are available, be sure to subscribe, like, and ring the bell.